And now we're going to jump forward a little bit in time, and we're going to spend some time in this video talking about the 1940s and the 1950s. We start in 1938, the late 1930s, with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and then the 1948 Commodity Credit Corporation Charter Act, and the Agricultural Act of 1949. And what's important to remember about what happened in basically the 40s, this roughly 10-11 year time period, we consider this to be the era of permanent legislation. What do we mean by that? Well, when we pass a law, the law is permanent until it is repealed unless the law has a timer on it. Modern farm bills all have a timer, and these modern farm bills all basically pause the old farm bills from the 30s and the 40s. So if we don't pass a farm bill today in our modern era, we will revert back to the old farm bills of the 30s and the 40s. The thing to remember about these farm bills is we have since learned that these were incredibly expensive ways to subsidize agriculture, and we found more efficient ways and ways that are easier on the federal budget to reach the same end. So that's one of the big downside of the way we used to subsidize agriculture is the cost and the economic distortion, and we found better ways to do it. And if we ever not pass a farm bill, we basically revert back to the old legislation. So we consider this the era of permanent legislation. Let's start with the 1938 Agricultural Adjustment Act. And what we see happening here is the concept of parity is popping up. So we had a precise definition of parity, and more importantly, we have some rule in place where if prices ever fall below some threshold that's based on parity, some percentage of the parity, then the farmers will have access to some type of subsidy, in this case, a non-recourse marketing loan from the Commodity Credit Corporation, the CCC, that's the Commodity Credit Corporation. The 1938 Ag Adjustment Act also authorized marketing quotas, and they had a thing called a producer referendum. So basically what this means is that all of the farmers in a given area had to vote, and if a majority, probably a 2/3 majority, I don't remember, it might be in our textbook, if a majority votes in favor of this referendum, then the federal government has the right to impose marketing quotas. And the way the marketing quotas worked, they worked just like that production quota that we did when we studied the supply and the demand curves, the economic impacts of these policies. For all practical purposes, these marketing quotas would limit the amount that could be sold at the government support price. So if you happen to produce more than your allotment, you could still sell the surplus, the stuff above the allotment. I shouldn't use the word surplus there. The extra would be the correct word to use. But you can't sell it at the higher price that the government would guarantee. So that's what's going on back in 1938. Interestingly enough, a little historical note here, crop insurance actually appeared in 1938 on the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And the textbook that we used for the class cited disappointing results. And I find that interesting. What do we mean by disappointing results? We mean that farmers didn't really take up the crop insurance. They didn't go out and buy crop insurance. And there's a reason why farmers historically don't like buying crop insurance, and that's because crop insurance is very expensive because insurance companies don't like writing crop insurance policies because of this thing right here, correlated risk. What does that mean? Well, if I insure my house against a fire, the probability of my house burning down is pretty much independent of the probability of houses in the town I live burning down. It's a random thing that happens, and it's not necessarily connected to what's going on at my neighbor's house. If I get into a car crash, other than the person that I hit, there's no real interconnectedness between my odds of a car crash and the odds of someone else in town having a car crash. That's not what we call it's not correlated. The two things aren't related to each other. The problem with agricultural risk is it tends to be correlated. Agricultural production risk, especially because if there's a drought, the drought hits a large area. And so you have every farmer in the southern corner of the state experience a drought, and they all would file a crop insurance claim. So insurance companies don't like that type of risk because it means they might go for years without ever paying a claim, and then all of a sudden, bam, they get hit with this massive claim that they can't afford to pay. And so crop insurance companies would charge a very high premium for the insurance, and it wouldn't be affordable for the farmer, so no one buys it. we're going to see crop insurance pop up again in the future, way into the future, our past, of course. We see them pop up in the 1980 and the 2000 farm bills, and they're much more successful. The results aren't as disappointing at that point, mostly because the subsidy for the crop insurance is going to be a lot bigger at these future dates when we get to them in our story. All of these market distorting policies that guarantee farmers get a higher price seem to come with some type of supply control. So we're guaranteeing the price the farmer can get, and we're limiting the amount of stuff the farmer can produce. So what we have is this situation where, because the price is high, the farmer wants to produce more. It's just the law of supply, but no one would buy it at that price, meaning the market would not clear. And so we use our supply controls, our allotments, our production quotas, our marketing quotas, in an attempt to minimize that surplus production. So the supply control is going to be a big part of the story of agricultural policy up until really the 1990s. Here's an example of how an allotment worked. I pulled this out of the textbook we used for the class. There's a quotation marks around it and everything. It's off page 82 of our book. Our book, of course, is Agricultural Policy in the United States by Novak, Peace, and Sanders. And this is an example, and you can read in the book yourself if you've bought it, of how the allotment system works. You have some arbitrary time period. In this case, it's 5 years. And we look at how much was produced in the last 5 years and how much individual farms produced in the last 5 years. Someone up in Washington makes a decision. Again, it's an arbitrary decision about how much we should produce in the United States, in the entire country. So the Secretary of Agriculture would say, oh, hey, this year, here's an arbitrary number, 10%. We're going to have too much production, so we're going to put a marketing quota out there. And if a farmer wants the price support, they have to agree to limit their production, and they throw out this 2/3 voter referendum so the people get a chance to vote on whether or not we want the actual marketing quota. Now, the 1954 Agricultural Act added some stuff to go along with that. The Commodity Credit Corporation, by this point, has started to begin to pile up excess commodities, surpluses that are out there in the economy that they've been buying up in an attempt to support prices. So these production controls and these marketing quotas and these allotments weren't enough to keep stockpiles of food from building up. And they would sell it, and they would donate it, and they would barter. They would trade food for whatever they wanted to trade food for. They would give it away with the school lunch program and food assistance programs. And the important thing for our discussion at the moment is international food assistance. Never forget, this is all going on during the Cold War. And if there are countries out there that are having a hard time feeding themselves, we can basically use that food assistance as a way of creating allies. There's a 1956 Agricultural Act. What you have to remember is that in spite of our production controls, and in spite of our attempts to toss these extra CCC commodities we still kept producing more food. Why? Well, when you subsidize the price, farmers aren't stupid. They actually follow the law of supply. They're going to produce more. And in the middle of this, we had considerable amounts of technical change. Post-World War II, we start using commercial-grade fertilizer because it turns out that the main ingredients in commercial-grade fertilizer are also the main ingredients in high explosives, which makes fertilizer to be just a little bit dangerous. And post-World War II, we figured out how to fix nitrogen in order to make these high explosives, and it turns out it makes great fertilizer too. So we've got this massive technological change that's happening during the 1950s. And in the 1950s, according to our book, the cost associated with storing the surplus CCC, the Commodity Credit Corporation stockpiles, were pushing $1 billion a year. Let's put this in context. We spent $500 million in 1929 in our first attempt to support agricultural prices, and now we're at a point where it takes $1 billion a year just to maintain the stockpile. So the programs are beginning to get expensive, and when programs start to get expensive, they become a little bit less popular politically. So we're reaching a point where something's going to have to change soon. I want to talk a little bit about a guy named Willard Cochran. So Willard Cochran's known for several things, and there's a quote in our book from Willard Cochran. And according to Mr. Cochran, he said this in 2003, he said during the 1950s, agricultural output was increasing at 2.5% a year, but population was only increasing at 1.8% a year, meaning that our supply is growing faster than our demand, and that's going to put downward pressure on food prices. That's going to put downward pressure on our commodity prices. That's a problem. There's even this thing that's credited to Cochran called Cochran's agricultural treadmill. Some call it the agricultural treadmill. If prices are falling, the only thing that a farmer can do about it is adopt better technology so they can lower their production cost or produce more at the same cost, right? So the average cost of production's got to fall, and if the average total cost of producing doesn't fall, while prices are falling, the farmer's going to have a hard time making a profit and therefore making a living. So that farmer is out there adopting technology. The problem, of course, is that technological adoption shifts the supply curve out, which causes prices to fall. And what ends up happening is you have different types of farmers. You have the early bird, that farmer who's out there on the cutting edge, who's going to be the first one to pick up a new type of technology. The early bird has a little window where they can implement the technology, increase their production, and increase their profits before everyone else figures out what's going on. And when they figure out what's going on, out goes that supply curve, down goes that price. And that bulk of farmer in the middle, that just kind of average farmer that figures it out a couple of years after the early bird does, they all adopt the technology and they ship the supply curve out, and the supply curve falls. And what's left behind are what Cochran referred to as the laggards. And the laggards are back there falling behind, and they essentially have no choice but to either get out of farming or go and use this new technology, and they never really get a chance to benefit from it in the way that the early birds did. So that's Cochran's treadmill. And so you just got to keep picking up new technology over and over and over again. And if you don't, you end up falling behind. An economist named Julian Alston referred to this concept, well, a similar concept. He called it immiserizing technical change. In other words, technical change that causes misery because the technical change causes the price to fall faster than it causes your cost to fall. So Cochran's treadmill and Julian Alston's immiserizing technical change are related concepts. Julian Alston he's an old timer, but he's still an active agricultural economist. I met him at a conference a few years ago. He's an Australian fella, a real character, a real hoot to hang out with. So there you go, immiserizing technical change and Cochran's treadmill.